everyone. Today, our Facebook Live topic is Understanding and Healing Birth Trauma with Christiane Lafleche. My name is Nancy McLaren Kennedy, and I'm a peer specialist and mental health worker with Women's Mental Health at the Royal. And this Facebook Live is part of a collaboration between the Ottawa Birth and Wellness Centre and Women's Mental Health at the Royal. So I wanted to point out that there are other Facebook Lives available on the Ottawa Birth and Wellness Centre's on Facebook page. And one of those include Ask the Experts with Teresa Bandrowska and Nicole Pichette, who are both registered midwives. And they talk about birth, pregnancy, and postpartum in the time of COVID. So in addition to Facebook Lives, the collaboration has also done some groups. One group is a perinatal wellness group, and the other is journaling as a wellness tool. So we're going to be monitoring the comment section, and we will be asking the questions to Christiane at the end of the presentation. Also, a recording of this presentation will be available afterwards for people who either missed it or weren't able to watch the whole presentation. So I'd like to introduce Christiane Lafleche. She has a master's in social work and is a registered social work in private practice. She uses a trauma-informed feminist lens to support folks in their reproductive journey. So it's my pleasure to welcome you, Christiane.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor, really. So thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah, so welcome, everyone. And I guess I'll start by just saying a little bit more about myself. So as Nancy said, I do have a master's in social work, but I also have a bachelor's degree in gender studies and psychology. So that really informs my my practice and my way of interacting with my clients. I also have birth trauma. So from my first birth, I experienced birth trauma, and that really is what drove me to specialize in this field. And I've experienced postpartum depression as well. So that's another lens that I bring in my work. So yeah, so personal experiences and academic experiences. And I also kind of want to honor your experiences, because the things that I'm going to be talking about are obviously very limited to my own knowledge, my own knowing. But you guys are all bringing in very different backgrounds. And so some of the things that I'm going to be talking about might not sit well with you, or you might disagree, and that is perfectly good and perfectly okay. And so just wishing that you honor your own knowledge as well. And so the first thing I want to do is actually just allow you or invite you to tune in to how present you are in this moment right now. And you know, oftentimes when we listen to these streams or these recordings, people are like, you know, put your phone away, focus. And that's not what I'm going to be saying today, because I really think it's important that you take care of yourself. So you might need to be cooking while you listen to this topic. It's a really triggering topic. You might need to be, you know, caring for your children. You might need to be scrolling on your phone. And there's no shame in any of those things. You might need to not watch the entire thing. And so I'll invite you right now to just notice what is happening in your body, and if there is activation, if there is stress, anxiety, pressure, anything, and just see what could I do to kind of increase the comfort level of my body. So right now, for example, I'm kind of cold, so it would be nice for me to like just get a blanket and be cozy. So just really check in with your body and see, what does it need? Does it need to go pee? Does it need to have a cup of tea? A piece of chocolate, maybe. You need to be petting a dog in order to be paying attention to this, or in order to kind of be present. And if maybe you're not able to be present, so you turn it off, and that's also very okay. So I just really want to make sure that you guys know that, and continue to do this check-in throughout the session, throughout the presentation, so that you ensure that you're not re-traumatizing yourself and that you're not triggering yourself. Okay, so the agenda for this presentation basically is going to be, the first thing we're going to talk about is what trauma is, and then what makes birth trauma unique, what's special about birth trauma, the consequences of birth trauma on the family, on the parent, and all of these things, on the child. How to prevent birth trauma. This is going to be a kind of split section where we're going to talk about prevention on the caregiver side, but also prevention on the birther side. And then how do we heal trauma? How, is it even possible to heal trauma? What do I do when I'm getting triggered, right? Because we get triggered when we're traumatized, and it happens often, and it's hard. And we have to continue on our lives, and that's really difficult. And then, will my child be harmed by my trauma? You know, and that's a really big concern that folks have. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, we'll end with post-traumatic growth and what happens after we heal from trauma. And I also have a pile of books here that I'll show you as resources for you and for your own healing. So the first topic, what is trauma? First, I just want to say that I am going to be I'm referencing a lot of the work from Peter Levine and from Cheryl Tatano Beck. Cheryl Beck is one of the authors of the books I'm recommending, Traumatic Childbirth. She's a leading researcher in this field. And Peter Levine doesn't focus on childbirth trauma, but he focuses on trauma and has written Waking the Tiger, which I also very highly recommend to anyone who's experienced trauma. His approach, somatic experiencing, is the approach in which I'm trained for trauma work. So this is kind of the sources of my knowledge here. So Peter Levine talks about trauma as the nervous system being overwhelmed by a perceived threat to safety. So that means it doesn't have to be something that happened to you where you almost died or you almost witnessed your friend dying, which kind of was the previous definition in the DSM. Trauma, he describes as more of any time it's happened in your nervous system. So it's not so much about what happened, but it's the impact it had for your nervous system. So someone who has a more vulnerable, let's say, or less flexible or less resilient nervous system, these are kind of judgmental words and just for lack of better ones, but they might experience something as traumatic when somebody else with a more flexible nervous system wouldn't. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the risk factors. But I like this definition because it includes a much wider variety of traumas. For example, racism, which it doesn't mean that you may not have been almost harmed or killed by someone in order to fear racism and experience racism as trauma. If you see people that look like you being harmed all the time, then that will be traumatic, right? So that's the good thing about this definition. And so I'll show you a little bit of what happens in our nervous system in this handmade drawing here. So we've got the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And then here we've got, like, in the more sympathetic, we've got, you know, that fight, that flight. That's where we kind of try to, you know, run away and get angry and all of these things. And then over here, we've got this freeze where it's like you just kind of zone out, you know, you're out of there. And then over here, we've got like rest, you know, and digestion. So that's like the healthy parasympathetic, where we're able to you know, go to sleep, relax, and all of these things. And here, this is the ventral connection realm, where we want to be. So, you know, when you're having a nice meal with family that you like, and you're enjoying your friends, and you are connecting, you're joking around, you're smiling, that is where when you're in ventral. And there's a beautiful flexibility in ventral where, you know, we're able to kind of relax and engage, activate and relax. And what we want in a healthy nervous system is this flexibility between all of the things. And there's nothing wrong with any of these things. This is a natural process, like a deer going into freeze in order to avoid danger is not bad. There's nothing shameful about that. That's how they survive. So it's really important to really remove the judgment from all of these things, because there is a place for all of these survival mechanisms to be. So what happens when you're traumatized is that you sometimes get stuck up here or stuck down here, because trauma, it creates this like it makes you believe like the trauma is not done. So it's like you think that you're still in danger. You still think you're at your birth, right? It's still very vivid in your body. It is visceral. You still are here. You didn't get to complete this process. You didn't get to let all this energy out, so it's stuck. So then you see someone who's more stuck in parasympathetic, might be highly anxious, hypervigilant, concerned all the time, unable to settle, unable to be present. Someone in freeze might be zoning out, really confused, not having good memory, might be sleeping odd hours, and people can jump from one or another. Now, this is a very simplified drawing, so I just want to say that because it's much more complex than this, but this is just giving you a bit of an idea of what kind of happens. And you might kind of already sense like, oh, what is my nervous system like? You know, do I tend to be more activated, or do I tend to be more freezy? Do I tend to jump from one to the other? And then the other thing that happens too is fawning. Now, fawning, the way that I've been taught about fawning is that it's a mixture of the flight response and the freeze response, right? So it's kind of like this holding back. I don't like this. I want to run away, but I have to stay here. So I'm going to just like contain my anger or contain all these things. And I'm going to be really polite. This is something that people who have been raised as girls really often engage in, right? Because we're taught to be polite and to be nice. And this happens a lot in birth because there's these authority people, right? Medical professionals that have a lot of power, and we're asked to, we're in a very vulnerable yet very powerful position, and the power is not really encouraged oftentimes, but depending on the professionals and the place that you're giving birth, but we tend to fawn. So I remember for me in my birth, I would, you know, say like, please, like, can I please have this? Oh, okay, no problem. You know, like make myself small, make myself sweet, make myself like a little girl. And yeah, so that's a really common occurrence. So that's a good thing to be mindful of. And so, yeah, so that's pretty much that. Yeah, and the last thing I kind of want to say on that is sort of imagine how hard it is to connect with a new baby, to heal your body, like really to heal your body, spend time healing this body that's just birthed, when you are holding in and containing all of this fight, flight, and freeze energy. It is a tremendous task, and that is, it impacts people for years to come. And that is one of the things that makes birth trauma unique, which is our next topic, right? Birth trauma is unique in that it causes harm to a newborn baby, right? In that if the parent and the birther is traumatized, of course it's going to impact their relationship, right? Now, the other things that make birth trauma unique is that birth is often performed or often, yeah, done by women or people who have been raised as girls or other marginalized people. And so if we look at, Cheryl Beck talks about the earthquake model. The earthquake model is basically that, you know, you kind of have this, I'm trying to find the picture here and maybe I won't be able to. Yeah, won't be able to. So the earthquake model is basically that, like, the more risks you have, the more little traumas you have in your story, the more likely you are to experience trauma. And I've kind of talked about the nervous system being vulnerable, so you can kind of think of it that way. So for example, if we take the example of women, they might have experienced a lot of discrimination, oppression, sexual assaults, and other types of forms of marginalization. And so that may create a vulnerability to experiencing birth trauma. So that's one of the things that makes trauma during birth special, you know, and it's very important to know this because it actually allows us to know, like, well, if we are treating these people who are vulnerable, like, we should already be trauma informed. We should already be taking these steps to prevent trauma from happening. And the other thing that Cheryl Titano Beck talks about is that trauma is in the eyes of the beholder. So again, it's that same concept as the nervous system versus the content. So you can never assume that a certain birth was traumatic or not traumatic. Like, there are many people in the room, all with different nervous systems. They will not all experience the same birth as traumatic. My father is a doctor, and he does a lot of births, and he asked me, like, why, like, how many people do you see? Like, how many people need this? Like, I've done so many deliveries, and I can't imagine all these people being traumatized because it wasn't traumatizing to him in his eyes, right? So it's definitely something that needs to be respected, and folks need to be curious about is this person traumatized? And I'm not going to assume that they are or that they are not. So what are the causes and the risk factors for trauma during birth? Well, first, this is basically from Cheryl Titanos-Beck's research, so just so you know. So there's powerlessness in labor, lack of information, and a very high intensity of pain. Caregivers seen as unsympathetic, emergencies and high interventions, lack of control during birth, and low levels of support. Just like take a minute and just notice what most of these things are. They're preventable, right? They're things that caregivers have in their power to address. And I also want to add, like, healthcare providers are also burnt out and also traumatized. So I don't think that it's, people being just nasty and mean that causes the problem. It's more systemic than that. It's a lack of resources, a lack of understanding of mental health, and also education in the medical field that is not women-centered, that is not trauma-informed, and all of these things. So, most of these things we have it in our power to change those things. Things like emergencies, sometimes they're not in our control. But from my experience, emergencies are not always considered traumatic. What makes them traumatic is when there's an emergency mixed in with a lack of information, with powerlessness, with lack of control, with low levels of support, with unsympathetic caregivers. So it's like I've had clients who had interventions, emergencies, C-sections, and they're like, no, it was fine. Everyone was so informative. They were asking me questions. They were explaining to me what was happening in all of these things. So just keeping that in mind, right? So it's kind of interesting. And what are the consequences of birth trauma? What happens when we have birth trauma? Obviously, it's going to affect our relationship with our child and our spouse. It doesn't necessarily mean that, you're going to have bad attachment or whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean that, but it could. The other thing I want to say is it affects people for years. And this is something that my clients talk about and are so angry about, is like, this doctor came in or this nurse came in randomly and just did this for like 2 seconds. They never saw me again, and they go on with their lives. And here I am 5 years later, still working on this trauma. Right. That is so enraging because it just could so be prevented, yeah. And then it affects the breastfeeding relationship as well. Obviously, if you're, stuck in fight or flight, your body's not going to work as optimally as we would like. It affects your pelvic floor healing and your pelvic floor function. It affects your attachment, possibly. It could affect your sexuality. That's another big one. Your plan and decision-making about family planning, right? Like, I don't want to do this again, so I won't be able to have a sibling for this child, and I really wanted that. And then obviously some mental health complications. Yeah, heavy stuff. So just take a minute and just notice, you might be feeling angry too. I know I am. And so just check in and see if there's anything you need to do, like shaking it out, pushing a wall, punching a pillow. Maybe not, maybe you're freezing, that's okay. So just take care of yourself. So how do we prevent trauma? Now, this is more practical and actionable steps here that I have for you. So in terms of healthcare providers, obviously there's so many things they can do to prevent trauma by being highly informed, by increasing the amount of information that they give their clients, by increasing the sense of control. So asking clients what they prefer, inviting them to do things versus telling them to do things, giving them choices. So, you know, for example, like, are you comfortable in this position? Do you feel like you need to move? Whatever. Do you need help to move? And that kind of thing. Caring, like, honestly, that's amazing. Like the impact that a caring person can have on a birther is miraculous, right? So I've heard stories of folks, you know, being in terrible pain and just having one caring person making that pain bearable, or just this one caring person that came in and saw that they were in pain postpartum and just showing empathy, and that being like super amazing. Yeah, like I know from my own experience, having one nurse be like defending me a little bit, very, very subtly, because she was kind of scared of the doctor, but defending me subtly was like a buoy. I could just like, okay, I'm gonna be okay. You know, it didn't make the trauma go away, but I think that it could if it was strong and a lot of folks were caring. And then also giving them respect and choice of boundaries. Like, what are your boundaries? Respecting those boundaries, and never assume that trauma is there or not there based on what you think. And also looking for signs of trauma. So like the hypervigilance, the confusion, the continuing to talk about the story over and over and over again, going back and going back again and again, and having dreams about it. Flashbacks. And flashbacks are not like in the movies. Flashbacks are very much like you just suddenly start thinking about it, and then it's like you zone out for a little bit while you think about it. It's not like, oh dear, like in the movies, it makes it seem like you're actually brought back, and it's not necessarily like that. And so what can folks do themselves to prevent birth trauma from happening again, or prevent birth trauma from happening in the first place? So first, it would be choosing a care provider that's in line with your values. So a care provider that you feel safe with. So sometimes you can't always choose who's going to be there at your birth, but at least for the duration of your pregnancy, you can kind of choose who you feel like you can chill with, not someone that on paper seems good, because that does not mean your body feels safe. So just tuning in with your body and being like, who do I feel like relaxed with? And then adding layers of support, such as doulas, friends, family that are around that can be present. I know that doulas are not, you know, at the hospital you have a limit of how many people you can have right now, but that may mean you choose to have a doula instead of your partner there. There are no rules saying that your partner needs to be there. If you feel more comfortable with a doula, you go with a doula. So adding as many layers of support as you can. If you need therapy, like add therapy. If you need acupuncture, add the acupuncture. If you know, like whatever you need, you add. And then knowing your boundaries. So how do you know your boundaries? Is you practice noticing yeses and nos in your body. And so, for example, if I think of mushrooms, I kind of have a no in my body because I don't like mushrooms. So I kind of notice this very tiny little constriction and like, no, I don't really, no, you know. If I think of ice cream, woo, now I feel like really open, excited, and I'm looking forward to it. I notice this expansion, this warmth in my body. And so this is just a kind of silly example, but you can kind of do that with birth stuff too. But you need to know what your yes and no is, because sometimes we go into our head, but we need to get out of there and go back into the body. So for example, if you're thinking, I know for me with my second birth, I remember just imagining myself giving birth in my home alone with my husband in my room, and that was like a big yes for my body. My body was like, that's what I want. Now, this is not exactly what happened. I didn't want to have like a birth alone with my husband, really. Like I needed a midwife or someone there. So in the end, that was my signal that home was safer for me. Now it could be the opposite, right? It could be like, I need to know the drugs are there, right? So that gives your body some relaxation. So you pay attention to what your body tells you. And then demanding dignity through consent. Now, this is something that should be just understood and known, but unfortunately it is not. So like in your birth plan, make a birth plan that don't focus your birth plan on like, you know, I want natural, I want the cord cut and things like that. Focus your birth plan on things that the healthcare providers are actually able to control and that they can't argue against. So for example, ask permission before you touch me. Ask permission before entering the room. Only people directly involved in my labor are allowed in the room, because you can't just come in and pick up something and leave. You need to ask permission before you enter. Introduce yourself before you enter. Tell me exactly what you're doing when you touch my body. Vaginal exams done with consent, enthusiastic consent. And saying, oh, sure is not consent, right? So that's really important for folks to know, for healthcare providers to know. The other thing that happens often is that healthcare providers might ask like 100 times for the same thing. Like, you know, do you want the epidural? Do you want the epidural? That happened to me. They kept pushing medication. They're like, you're so anxious. You have to have medication. I'm like, I don't want medication. I want my husband to be present, and you're not allowing him to be present. I don't want medication, but they forced me, like they kept asking. So at some point it's like, fine, I'll take the medication. Like that is coercion. Like that's not consent at all. If they say no once, they know the option is there, like stop asking. So like, and I am obviously not a midwife or a doctor, so like I'm sure that there's another side to all of this, but I do have to really stress that consent needs to be taken way more seriously. And then we're obviously working, knowing your triggers is really important too. So what triggers you? Is it the smell? Is it the gown? Is it the people? Is it an area that you don't like touch? Is it a word? Like for me, cooperate was a big trigger. And I was like, to my midwife with my second, I said, please never use the word cooperate with me. Or even just breathe. I was like, don't tell me to breathe. Like I know to breathe. So it can be different for different people. But just know that and write that down in your birth plan. Again, like don't use this word. I didn't like when people used honey or mommy. Like no, I'm not your mommy. Don't call me mommy. Call me by my name. And maybe people would love being called mommy. So it's totally individual. That's why it's so important to write it down, because the healthcare providers can't know, they can't get this, right? And then obviously working with a trauma-informed therapist is super helpful, working through a trauma. And so how do we heal trauma? What do we do to heal it when it happens? The good news is it is healable. We can get through that. Personally, I really like a somatic approach because that's the area I'm trained in. There are different approaches out there. Connecting with the body is really important in the somatic approach, obviously. And Waking the Tiger is a book I highly recommend. Waking the Tiger by Peter Levine. It has lots of practical ways of discharging trauma from the body. So if the body is holding the trauma in the nervous system, we need to allow the body to fight, flight, and freeze-ish in order to kind of allow that to be done, the story to be done. Movement is really helpful. So like noticing when you're triggered, like allowing that to move. So dancing, shaking it out, running, art and creative writing is so healing. Like, because trauma is not stored up here. It's stored back here in the limbic system. It's stored in a place where, you know, it's kind of disconnected from the cerebral part of our brain. So we need to, so art and creative writing and expression is really helpful in allowing those colors to kind of form and to express themselves and to build this bridge between these two places. So that's something I highly recommend for anyone. Even if you don't know how to do art, it doesn't matter. Like I can show you, an ugly thing I made when I was working through my birth trauma. She used to have long hair, but they fell, they broke. But that little statue, it means so much to me, and it's not the thing I would sell, but all of that emotion and anger and rage went into that statue and the feeling. And this is just clay from the dollar store. Like it's nothing fancy, but it allows those feelings to kind of be channeled into something healthy and productive. And then ritual and ceremony, right? Doing a rebirthing ceremony, or possibly like in my trauma groups, sometimes what we would do is have flowers, and then with each petal, we would take out and we would put the, what's the word I'm looking for? Like turn the rose around, like share the rose and pass it around and take off the rose petals. And with each petal, we would say something we were leaving behind. So ceremony and ritual is very helpful as well. I'm just trying to read my handwriting here. Oh, getting your notes, right, from the healthcare providers. So that can be really healing as well, to see what they are, and then debrief with the healthcare professional. Like, what does this mean? What happened? The only thing I'll say about that is that sometimes the notes are lacking a lot of information. They are not what they're only one perspective, right? So that's can sometimes be really enraging again. So that can be triggering in some ways. So just notice if that's something you feel like you need to do it. And then the other thing is complaining. Please write complaints. There's someone in Ottawa, in Toronto, called the complaint doula, and she like helps people complain, and that's so, it can be really satisfying to complain. Although again, same thing is sometimes not the thing you get back in. Like the response you get is not really satisfying, but you can always try. And sometimes it feels good. And no matter what, even if they don't do anything to you, these complaints go into the system, and you can be assured that, you know, you're a voice in many, many voices that is saying there's something wrong with this. And then what about when I'm like super triggered? What do I do when like those super intense feelings come? So doing sensory things is really helpful. There's that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise where you do like 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, feel, 3 things you hear, 2 things you smell, 1 thing you taste. You notice things around you like that. Other things is like finding pleasure things for each sense. So an exercise I do often with clients is like we go through each of the senses, and then we identify 5 things in each sense that gives us pleasure, that gives us comfort and peace. So it could be like the smell of coffee, it could be the sound of the rain, it could be when someone strokes my hair. And so then you can invite those things to kind of bring you back in the present. Getting up and away, like doing something else, orienting to where you are in the space. So noticing like, hey, here I am. Sometimes tapping, being like, hey, I'm an adult, I'm me, this is the date, today is the 10th of December, it's 2020, blah, blah, blah. So just reminding you that you're not there, you're not back there. It can be really helpful. One of the things I do when I'm triggered around my kids, and I have a blog post on this, so you can kind of take a look. I have a blog post on a lot of these things, so please feel free to get informed there as well. But with kids, I'll ask them to build me a boundary, because I'm like, so overwhelmed, and they're overwhelming me too. So I'll ask them to kind of build a boundary with like cushions and pillows around me, or toys, and say, you're not allowed to go in the boundary, you have to stay out of the boundary. And it just makes me feel so much safer. And the other thing is explain to people, explain to your kids, explain to your work if possible, or your partner or whatever, I'm traumatized, I'm triggered right now, like I need some space. Being in the water is really nice. The water holds a lot of space for us. Moving, getting outside, dancing. So a lot of the same things that would heal trauma are helpful, but you want to just kind of, in general, just get back into your body. Now, the last thing is, or the second to last thing is, will my child be harmed by trauma? Well, the answer is maybe, depends on their nervous system. Again, we don't know if they were traumatized by the same birth as you. The other thing is, trauma is part of life. If it won't be the birth, it'll be something else. So there's no like, it's not the end of the world if your child is traumatized. Children are also very resilient. They have a very flexible nervous system. They don't have a bunch of earthquakes. They might, if perinatally, in the womb, like there was trauma, they might have more, but still it's such a short amount of time. So they're less likely to have built a number of traumas, right? So healing is always possible. That's really important to remember. Kids love to play out these things, so allow kids to play them out. Like my kid would always hide under the blanket and pretend to be born, and pretend to be born again and again and again, and he loves that. An osteopath can be really helpful as well. They can kind of allow a rebirthing to happen physically. We did that for my son, and it was really helpful. Talking about your birth honestly, obviously not saying like, I don't know, like, you know, in a child appropriate way, but being honest, like that was really rough because they know, right? One of the things I did with my own son is to write and draw his birth story. Now, before the age of like 3 or so, or around the age of 3, like kids are verbal enough to explain to you what happened, but also they remember it physically. They don't remember it explicitly, but implicitly in their bodies, they'll remember. So like my son and I, he drew pictures of his birth. He remembered heat, coolness. He remembered like being stuck. He described like a pink bowl on his head being stuck. So like a pink bowl, right? Like I never mentioned that to him. So that was really the way that he could describe his very physical experience. The other thing you can do is rebirthing, right? So a rebirthing session with a doula and a birth tub, and just allow your baby to kind of like obviously like you can't put him back in and kick him out, but like you can allow the baby just kind of to have a moment with you in the birth pool the way that you had imagined it. And so that's that, and I'll be happy to see any questions about all of these things. The last thing I want to mention is that after trauma, growth is possible. We experience something called post-traumatic growth. So you can just kind of see that as the old ways, the old habits you had of coping that are no longer useful are going to be shed, right? And so you become wiser, more mature, more badass. You greet this kind of shadow self, right? You really come face to face with that shadow part of you. I really like to imagine this kind of the fawning. For me, that was a big thing that kind of went away. It was like, you know, screw this, this doesn't work. And then that was for my own personal experience. But I want to share a poem that I wrote called Dropping the Crown that will really illustrate that post-traumatic growth. And then after that, I'll show you a few books and I'll be ready for some questions. So here I go with the poem. All right, so it's called Dropping the Crown. Today I mourn my innocence. Erecting tall, I shed all that was left of my girlhood. The romance, the daydream, both forever gone. I no longer recoil at the thought of facing my shadow. No, I stand proudly as I face it, reach atop my head, wrap my fingers around my jeweled crown, my beloved cherished crown, the one I fought so hard to protect, but not today. Today I throw it on my looming shadow. It rattles onto the cold, dark, man-made ground. Take it, I scoff, it's worthless now. You removed me from my people. You isolated me naked. You stripped me of my power and shamed my vulnerability. I saw darkness on that day, the day I birthed my son. How I pled to you that day, how I bowed. But bowed to you I will no more. Today I become woman, and woman understands. You never really took from me. In fact, you could never have. My dignity is not within your reach. I wear my crown within. Today I wrap my hands around the playful, innocent hands of the life I birthed. My hands are those of a woman, no longer innocent, no longer romantic, no longer a girl, but a glorious woman. So just take a minute and see how that kind of sits with you or integrates in your system. I have more poems on my website, but I do want to say, like, be cautious when reading any of these things because it can be triggering, right? But yeah, you can kind of see in that poem the fawning, right? The fawning, how I begged, how I pled, right? And how now that's one of the things that I really rejected as a way for me to cope. Although, to be honest, sometimes you need to use fawning, and there's nothing shameful about it, because if I was really assertive, they would have and when I was assertive, actually, it did bite me in the butt. So when I said that I wanted them to be careful to ask permission before vaginal exams, I asked them to do a vaginal exam when I was ready to push, and they said, no, you're too anxious about it. So it can. So, right. So we use fawning for some good reasons sometimes. It's like if I'm too assertive, I'm going to be hurt. You can see that in like when you go dancing at a club and you're assertive, you get harassed for it, right? So fawning definitely has its place. So that's another thing that I want you to know. Yeah, so I invite you to go to my website to see some free resources, techniques, poetry. There's information on how to do art, creative art, healing art, and that kind of thing. And I just want to show you these books that I recommend. So this one is very clinical. So it's recommended for healthcare workers, midwives, therapists, that kind of thing, healing traumatic births. This one I recommend for folks who have experienced sexual assault. It's called Survivor Moms. There's another one called When Survivors Give Birth. That's really good as well. This one has lots of practical ways of healing traumatic birth. Just, yeah, little exercises that you can do, how to write your story and that kind of thing. This one is a big one, how to heal a bad birth. Lots of practical, really easy to read. You can kind of go bit by bit, do sections, exercises to do. And lastly, if you're preparing for a birth and you want to prevent trauma from happening again or at all, Pam England is great. Ancient Mouse to Modern Birth. She had 2 C-sections, but she has like a really honest way of talking about birth. Yeah, I like her. And she also has a birth trauma healing that she does, and she trains people in, and there's people here in Ottawa who do it. So that's another option. But yeah, I'm ready for questions if there are any, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Christiane. That was fantastic. We don't have a question as of yet, although someone said they seemed excited about the idea of a complaint doula, something I'm not very commonly heard of. Yeah. And someone else as well sharing that thank you so much for having shared that poem with us. That it's very beautiful.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you for listening to it. It's always I write my poems for myself, and it's always like, who would want to hear that? So that's really nice to hear. Yeah,
that's beautiful. We do have a question asking if it would be possible that you list the books online.
Yeah, I could probably go just like in the comment section, right?
That'd be perfect.
Great. Hi, Christiane. I also wanted to, you had mentioned going to your website, and I really think that your website is a fantastic resource for people. We're so lucky to have you. One of my reasons for asking you to come is also because I had experienced birth trauma myself. So a lot of things that you're saying, some of the things for the first time are very empowering. I think you're very brave for turning your experience into something that's helping other people and helping birthing people. And I love that you're saying trauma is in the eyes of the beholder. That really places a lot of importance on people's experiences that otherwise through different channels might not get acknowledged. Yeah. I wanted to comment that I really loved you putting a name to fawning. I think that's so important. In my birth experience, I was thanking the caregivers who at the same time were causing the trauma. And that was one thing I couldn't really get straight in my head, because why did I thank people when I'm being harmed by them? But fawning really, like a lot of your terminology and a lot of your explanations really are validating. And yeah, I just think that's fantastic. And so I really encourage people to go to Christiane's website and refer back to this presentation as many times as you need to. I'm thinking there might be a way for us to list the books in the chat section on Facebook so that people can go back and refer to that. So maybe just one last check to see if there's any other questions.
Yes, we do have a question that's come up here. One of our viewers here saying they're a doula and looking how to access some resources from their clients and training for herself. So that's something we can put in the comments as well, your resources and your
Yeah, for sure. And for doulas to train in birth trauma, there's also, like, Pam England has some training on birth story listening that might be useful as well. So that's a good place to start. Yeah.
We have a question as well asking, how do you know if you've had a birth trauma? If you could list some of the signs for people to look for.
Yeah. And that's such a wonderful question. And it kind of brings me back to what Nancy was saying, because oftentimes we dismiss our birth trauma because we're like, oh, well, like, people die in childbirth. Like, what am I complaining about, kind of thing. That's what I did a lot. It's like, oh, I shouldn't be complaining about this, kind of thing. But birth trauma, I always say, like, if you don't feel good about your birth, like, just chalk it up to trauma. Like, there's no trauma police that's gonna come and be like, you're not traumatized enough. Like, some of the signs would be, like, to think about your birth a lot. So going back and back and back, it's like playing it over and over, trying to figure out, like, what happened there? What could I have done different? What could I have done different? And a good way to describe it in a very visceral sense is that it's not integrated. It feels like it's like separate from you somehow. Like, I know with my second, I didn't have birth trauma, and like, it just, like, the birth just kind of happened, and then it was a part of me. But the first birth, it wasn't. It was very separate, very disjointed from my story, from my experience, and it was like I couldn't integrate it into my body, into myself. So that's another way of describing it. And more objective ways would be like having nightmares about it, feeling triggered, feeling hypervigilant. So I know after my birth trauma, I would, like, be walking down the street with my baby, and I'd be like, oh my God, who's going to come attack us? Like, it was like in Ottawa, like, no, there's in the daylight, there's nobody attacking us. But just this hypervigilance, this fear, this distrust of other people. And then, like, it could be like having trouble bonding. Again, like I said before, like the issues with sleep, being confused, not having, like, zoning out a lot, speaking more slowly than usual. It can look in so many things. So it's very individual. But I say, like, if you don't feel good about your birth, and that's why I call my birth trauma group birth ache group, because I feel like a lot of people won't identify with the word trauma. They'll think, oh, my birth wasn't as bad as other people, so I won't identify as that. But if you have a birth ache, if you don't feel good about your birth, that's enough. That's enough to, like, chalk it up to trauma. Yeah.
I have another question. I'm just wondering how birth trauma can impact the relationship with the partner. So if the partner was at the birth and the birthing person feels like they weren't supported by the partner or helped by the partner, what type of work happens with that?
Yeah, that happens very much. It requires a lot of repair, right? Because it can be like this attachment rupture when that happens, where you just don't feel like anyone was there for you. Rationally, we can be like, well, I understand that, blah, 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 blah. He was da-da-da, or she was da-da-da, but you can't help but feel unsafe around them. So yeah, I think, like, from my experience working with clients who have worked through this, having a lot of conversations, educating partners about what trauma is and why it was traumatic and all of these things is really helpful, because unless they understand what the person's gone through, like, it's just, there's a disjointed, they don't get each other, and that's really, really hard. So yeah, and the other thing it can be affected is sexuality as well, right? So I know for me, I had phases where, like, I experienced sex as rape, very much so, because that's how I experienced my birth. And so it was very activating, very terrifying. So that's really hard for a partner, like, to feel that as well. So working with different healthcare providers can help with that, like a physiotherapist, pelvic floor physiotherapist, working with a therapist, working with your doctors and medication, all these things. So again, getting as much support as you can to help. A couples therapist might be useful as well in those situations. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Christiane.
We have another question here. What if your trauma comes from the aftercare after the birth? Would that still fall under birth trauma?
Totally. Yeah. Perinatal trauma, whatever. It could be obstetrical trauma. There's so many words, right? But yeah, there's a lot, and it can be traumatic. The lack of care in postpartum can be traumatic, right? Like, being completely abandoned postpartum it can be traumatic. Colic can be traumatic. So yeah. And the same kind of the same kinds of ways of healing work as well in these cases. And I think that one of the things I didn't mention and I really wanted to mention is like the way that I perceive perinatal being like the perinatal period in this country, in this society, as a place where like a funnel where all like the sexism has gone. So you experience that in like the birth room, like slapping of thighs, yelling at people giving birth, calling them hysterical, all these things. Like it's like there's no respect, or just expecting women and birthers and parents to just kind of go on with their lives and like go do the groceries when they've just given birth, right? Like that's so oppressive, so horrible, and it is traumatic. So yes, like all of those things count as trauma.
Mm-hmm. Are there any more questions?
There aren't any questions right now. Definitely some comments. Thank you very much, Christiane.
And I know that people often come back to the Facebook Lives and have questions afterwards. Mm-hmm. So I believe that we're going to be checking for that, and any questions will be directed towards Christiane. So don't feel that if something comes to you later that you'd like to know, feel free to put in the comment section, and we will be watching that to answer those questions. Absolutely. So yeah, so again, I'd like to thank Christiane. This was an amazing presentation. Many people are going to learn from you, and I'm sure feel validated by what you're saying. I also want people to know that we're having this same presentation this afternoon. So Christiane is running a marathon here, and she will be presenting in French, and that's at 1 p.m. So if you'd like to hear it again in French, we welcome you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for listening, and I'm wishing everybody lots of healing, lots of support, lots of understanding and love.